Hi there. So my name is Beata Kozlowski and I am a research and instruction librarian here at SCAD Libraries. And today's workshop we're going to be talking about doing your own primary research. Right. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to talk about what primary research is. And we'll be talking about different qualitative research methods such as interviews, observations, surveys, and then we're going to end the session with a Q&A. If you have any questions that come up at the end during the workshop, save them for the end. Just a note, qualitative research methods, you might have heard that terminology before. Qualitative versus quantitative research. Now, the only difference there is quantitative deals with research around numerical data, whereas qualitative research is data or research that relies on personal accounts or documents that illustrate how people think or behave. So we're talking about interviews, observations, and surveys, and that definitely falls under qualitative research methods. So primary research, what is it, right? We're talking about doing primary research. It's a good foundational step to define what this is. So primary research is research that you conduct, okay? So it can include interviews, personal observations, experiments, surveys, etc. that you conduct. Whereas secondary research is research that you probably are familiar with already. This is research that other people have already conducted, and that can be found in books or articles. So this is probably the type of research that you've conducted in your classes as students. Right. So I did want to cover what different source types are out there, and sources can fall into three different categories: primary sources, your secondary sources, and your tertiary sources. So since we're talking about primary research, those sources are related, but a little bit different. So we're just going to quickly cover what these sources are. So primary sources are immediate first-hand accounts of a topic. They often are original documents, and folks who collect this information had a direct connection with event, etc. So some examples of primary sources are things like photographs, video, or audio that capture an event. Things that are in archives. So if you went up to our special collections here at the Gen Library on the third floor, you would find things like manuscripts, artifacts, ephemera, objects, diaries, newspaper reports, these kinds of things. Primary sources can also be considered newspaper reports by reporters who witnessed an event or who quote people who did. Okay, so it's that first-hand account of a thing. So your secondary sources are often an analysis of primary source documents. Okay, so things that fall into this category are books about a topic, scholarly or popular trade articles about a topic. And then also documentaries can be in this category as well. The photos or video portions can be considered primary sources, but that compilation that the documentary filmmaker is putting together is an analysis of those primary sources. So documentaries are considered secondary sources. And then you have your tertiary sources that compile and summarize secondary sources. So examples of tertiary sources could be bibliographies and encyclopedias. Right. Fabulous. So we're talking about primary research. Why would we do it? All right. So sometimes the answers are not out there already. Perhaps your research necessitates answers that others haven't researched before, so you're going to have to do it by yourself, right? So you may need information about a sect of the population or individual experiences. Which leads us to our first primary research type. And we're going to talk about interviews and best practices in terms of interviewing people. So interviews are understanding individuals' expressed subjective narrative, right? So examples of this is your classic job interview, of course, where both interviewee and interviewer are trying to gauge for fit for a job role. So asking questions can lead to good answers about how that individual feels about something, right? So that's an example. Family oral history projects are also example of interviews. For example, my father was born at the end of World War II in Poland. So I am doing a video and audio recording of his experiences in, post-World War II Poland. Documentaries, of course, are another example. We've all seen interviews within documentaries where the filmmaker is interviewing the person for added value to whatever narrative he or she is compiling. Right, so we're going to talk about interview best practices. So like anything in life, good preparation is key to success. So in the initial communication with your interviewee, when you're setting up times and days and content, etc., this is a good opportunity to build initial trust with your interviewee. And in line with that, you're going to be clear and upfront with the time commitment. Ensure you know how many sessions you need. Will one 1 hour session cover it, or are you going to have to do multiples? How many multiples? Are you going to interview your subject every Tuesday for the next 3 weeks for an hour? So let that be known and upfront. Also be clear in terms of intentions. What is your end goal with this interview? Right? Are you going to post it to TikTok? Are you going to include it in a film? So that confidentiality, how confidential are you going to keep this information? And ethics is very good to establish right at the beginning of this process so you can build that trust with your interviewee. And also establish if and how you can record and in what format. Are you going to be videoing your interviewee? Are you going to take audio? Will you be taking notes during this process? Okay. A lot of folks are more uncomfortable being on video than they would be in an audio recording. So just be clear and know what your intent is. It's also important to establish a suitable venue. You want it to be quiet and comfortable for both yourself and the interviewee. It needs to be relatively private. You don't want any eavesdroppers or folks just, around that will make your interviewee uncomfortable. It's also important to establish a recording method. Whatever technology you're using, establish that and ensure it works. Have a plan B. Are you going to use video, audio? What software are you going to use? And then also do some practice, do a test run, a dry run, interview a family member, a friend, establish those good practice before the actual interview itself. Right? Also very, very important is constructing effective research questions. You want to think deeply about what you want to ask and always keep your research objectives in mind so you have a big picture in mind as you approach this interview. You'll have to establish a structure. Do you want it to be semi-structured or structured completely? Just a side note, unstructured dialogues are rarely fruitful. You don't want the interviewee to go on in a meandering kind of fashion. You want some structure to the information you want to extrapolate from your interviewee. So it's important to establish some questions and themes, just have an idea of what goal, your end goal for the interview. Question format is also important to consider in terms of interview best practices. Avoid yes or no questions. You want to ask your interviewee open-ended questions so they have an opportunity to talk about what you're asking them, and to take your question in a different variety of ways. Also, try not to ask leading questions. You want that interviewee's subjective experience. You don't want to lead them down a road. Essentially, you want their interpretation of your question. So, also in terms of technique, it's best to put your interviewee at ease. You only have a limited amount of time with this individual to capture that information. So definitely be prepared. Come up with those interview questions. Have those themes in mind. Try to be calm, friendly, smile. Think about some risk management prior to the session as well. Do some troubleshooting for different occurrences that might arise. If there's traffic delays, again, any kind of equipment issues that might arise. It's also important to anticipate different respondents. Not all people are the same. So you will have your meanders, you'll have your terse answers. So play to your strengths. If you're not an extroverted person and you tend to be a little bit more introverted, play to that strength. Your calm demeanor will put your interviewee at ease. So think about those things before the interviewee. And then, like I mentioned before, keep your objectives in mind. You need to know what your research question is, your goal, and extrapolate meaningful content that way. Right. So we're on to our second research method, and that is observation. So we all do observation. We're all in different settings out in the world, and we observe folks in different environments and settings, and that's essentially what observation is. Observing people in naturally occurring situations to gain knowledge or information about the sample population. All right, so different types of observational research and why we do observational research. So some examples would be, if you're an illustrator who just got a freelance job about Savannah, you're supposed to illustrate some aspect of Savannah, and you decide to concentrate on our lovely live oaks that we have here. So you visit some parks and squares, and you study, the live oaks that are in those places. That would be an example of observational drawing and research. Some other examples of observational research would be perhaps you're a designer looking at redesigning an airport, like in this photograph. You have a hunch that perhaps some aspect of airport service would be better if you redesign the space, and you go to the airport to look at how people are engaging in that space. Another example of observational research, of course, would be anthropologists in the field if you're studying different cultures. Actors definitely do observational research as well to study human behavior. Animators in creating environments. They study different environments. So there's a lot of different ways that you could do observational research. In terms of best practices, just like doing interviews, you can have different types of structure to your observation. Structured, semi-structured, or unstructured. Be mindful that if you have a limited amount of time, unstructured observation can be a waste of time, right? You should have a goal in mind in terms of what you want accomplished during this observation. Right? So in terms of methodology and process, consider your role. What is your role going to be? Are you going to be a participant in the scene, or are you going to do unobtrusive observation? Are you going to sit on the sidelines and watch what is happening within the setting? Right. Also allow the data to emerge through the process. So at the beginning of your collection, you may have something in mind that you think is going to occur. However, something unexpected occurs. So allow this data to emerge while you're observing. And yes, just sit back and see what happens. So what's the value of observation? So you'll have a better understanding and of the context in which people interact. So it allows the researcher the opportunity to learn things about people that people will be maybe unwilling to discuss in an interview. And by observing these details, it really helps us understand what's going on in a particular situation. Okay. And another value added is that you're not imposing prior frames of reference onto the study. So, of course, we all have bias in terms of, the way in which we were raised, our views, our outlooks. So when you are observing, you are really focusing on what's going on in front of you. So those prior frames of reference are taken away. So if you read an article or a book, you're going to be also reading that author's bias. So hopefully the intention in doing observation, of course you bring your own biases, but the hope is that these prior frames of reference are removed from the observational practice. So some considerations when you're doing observational research is to observe with your research goals in mind. You want to add value to your research and consider how you're going to add value to your research in this observational practice. Again, consider your own bias and research intentions. And then also have a look at the context. What are you looking at, right? What does the site look like, smell like? Are there any distractions? Also consider any ethical access issues. Are you going to have folks sign informed consent forms, waivers? Are you going to guarantee their anonymity? Also, situations may occur where you hear or see things that are of a sensitive nature. What are you going to do in those situations, right? How will you organize your field notes? That is a very important consideration. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then also, will you have to use other research data methods as well, in addition to observational research? So field notes. Okay, so Mr. Silverman, who wrote the book Interpreting Qualitative Data, had some recommendations and some questions that observers should have in mind while they are jotting down field notes. And they are things like, what are the people doing? What are they trying to accomplish? Why? How are they doing this? How many people are in the scene? What else is happening at the site that's relevant to my research? You might want to consider how you're feeling while collecting this data. If you're not sure if to collect information, collect it, as it's better to have too much than not enough. And then you have to consider what you're going to do with that information that you gather, your field notes. After the fact, are you going to cull them? What format do you want to present this information to others as? Right. So you can practice doing observational research pretty much anywhere. All you have to do is develop a research question, and with that in mind, go to the location, and you can observe for a period of time and take field notes. Okay. So I was just in the park, and I was watching the people go by. There happened to be a homeless gentleman sitting on a bench close by to me, and I noticed that he was asking folks for money he wanted a drink. So I observed that he was more likely to ask single women who walked by rather than individuals that were part of a group. And this could be an example of observational research. Now, I didn't sit on the bench with that in mind, but I just have a general kind of proclivity to observing people in environments. So just an example. Right, so our third type of primary research that we're going to talk about are surveys. So surveys are a type of correspondence between researcher and a segment of the population with the goal of learning something about the population surveyed, some characteristics, opinions, etc. Okay, and some examples of a survey could be things like post-course faculty evaluations, as I'm sure that you've done in your classes. I know that I sometimes will do a library instruction evaluation. I'll ask students what they learned, what they didn't learn, and would have liked to learn, how happy or satisfied they were with the level of library instruction. So questions like that to evaluate the experiences of a population. You could also, another example of a survey would be a customer satisfaction survey for a product. So when is it a good time to conduct a survey? So a good time would be, or the ideal time, is when an individual or institution has a question or challenge that can't be answered with existing data. Okay? So some things to consider prior to conducting a survey. Okay, so you're going to have to develop your research questions, just like in an interview, just like an observation. Have some structure for your survey. Know what you want. What is your end goal with a survey? Also important, check to see if the data already exists. If it's out there already, there's no need to spin your wheels on doing something twice, right? Use that data. Also something to consider, what mode would it work best in? Perhaps you want to survey individuals or groups via the internet, via the phone. Is the mail going to be the best way to survey people, or is an in-person survey going to work best? Some considerations: who's your target population? What segment of the population do you want to survey? How long is the survey going to be? The complexity of the survey. Are you going to include an individual contact for questions if questions arise? So the survey takers have someone to ask those questions. And again, always consider your research questions. Construct questions that you think will answer your research questions. So regarding best practices, drafting your questionnaire, just like drafting your interview questions, objectives when it comes to observations. This is also very, very important. Draft your questionnaire survey using, these are your tips, using simple language. Write questions that are easy to answer. Also ensure that your questions come in a logical order. You don't want to confuse your the individual answering the survey with illogical order. Also, do draft some correspondence to your intended subjects, whether you're doing a survey via the mail or in person. Definitely include how you'll be using the results. Let that individual know if their information is going to be confidential and anonymous in that correspondence. Also important to consider sample size. How many people are you going to be surveying? And how are you going to select these individuals? Are they going to be randomly selected? Is it going to be a sample versus a census, right? In a census, everybody is surveyed. Most of the time, that doesn't make sense. You just want a representative sample of that population. So how many people is it necessary to achieve that saturation of information? You want a representative sampling of population to be representative of the whole. So how many folks do you have to survey to get to that, right? So also incentives. Are you going to have any incentives? Do you have a budget? How are you going to get folks to do the survey for you? And also very important is to test your survey on others prior to its launch. So before you do it for real, ensure that it's effective and it's extrapolating the information that you want on others before you launch it into the world for real. All right, so that was essentially a quick overview of 3 different types of qualitative research methods: the interview, the observation, and the survey. Of course, if you have any additional questions, you can, of course, reach out to us via library.scad.edu. And in the upper right on our website, this Ask a Librarian link is going to link out to all of our information. You could chat at us, you could give us a call, text us, email us, or you could request a research consultation. This is an in-depth research consultation where you'll sit down with one of our librarians, either in person or via Zoom. So all you have to do is fill out this form. But if you do have questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. I appreciate you attending this workshop session, and I wish you happy researching.